The grocery store was packed with people rushing through the aisles, filling their carts without a second thought. No one paid attention to the frail old man outside, slowly pushing a line of carts toward the entrance. His hands shook from exhaustion, his back hunched from years of labor. Every few minutes, he wiped his forehead, catching his breath before grabbing another stray cart from the parking lot. His name tag read, George, but no one ever bothered to call him that. To them, he was just an old man trying to keep a job he shouldn't have to do at his age. Keanu stood near the entrance, his hands tucked into his worn-out jacket pockets. He had stopped by to grab a snack, but now, he couldn't look away from George. There was something unsettling about the sight. A man who should be resting, spending his days with family, instead working himself to the bone just to survive. Keanu's jaw tightened. No one should have to live like this. As George struggled to push a heavy cart uphill, a group of teenagers walked past, laughing. One of them, a cocky-looking guy in a varsity jacket, nudged his friend and smirked. "Look at him, man. Should have retired like 50 years ago." The others chuckled, shaking their heads. George didn't react. Maybe he was used to it. Maybe he was too tired to care. Keanu's eyes darkened. He stepped forward just as the wind picked up, sending a loose receipt fluttering against George's leg. The old man sighed and bent down to pick it up, but his knees buckled. The cart slipped from his grip, rolling backward toward a parked car. In a flash, Keanu caught it, steadying both the cart and George before he could fall. "Whoa there, gotcha," Keanu said softly, gripping the old man's arm to keep him steady. George blinked up at him, surprised. "Thank you, son. These old bones ain't what they used to be." He chuckled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. Keanu glanced at the uniform George was wearing. "You work here?" George nodded. "Yeah, been here a few years. Social Security doesn't cover much, and I gotta eat, you know." He gave a tired smile. "Ain't no one hiring a 90-year-old for anything else." Keanu looked around. People were still walking past, ignoring the conversation. The store manager, a heavy-set man in a crisp suit, stood near the registers, chatting with an employee. Keanu's jaw clenched. "How much do they pay you?" Keanu asked. George chuckled. "Not enough. But it's better than starving." Keanu stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked inside. His footsteps were calm, measured, but there was a fire in his eyes. He had come in for a snack, but now, he was about to do something no one saw coming. Next, Keanu walked straight to the checkout lanes, where the store manager was laughing at some joke his employee had made. The man barely glanced at Keanu before returning to his conversation. Keanu didn't care. He grabbed a bottled water from a nearby fridge, walked up to the counter, and placed a crisp $100 bill on the conveyor belt. The cashier, a young girl with tired eyes, stared at the money, then at him. Sir, this is way too much. Keep the change," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. He took the water and walked off before she could protest. But he wasn't leaving. He was heading straight for the store manager. The man finally noticed him approaching, his expression shifting into a polite but uninterested smile. "Can I help you, sir?" Keanu didn't smile back. "Yeah, you can tell me why a 90-year-old man is out there breaking his back for scraps while you stand here doing nothing." The manager blinked, caught off guard. He chuckled, trying to brush it off. "Oh, George, he likes working. Says it keeps him busy." Keanu didn't move, didn't blink. The silence between them grew heavier. The manager shifted uncomfortably. "Listen, I don't set the rules," he applied. "We hired him. It's not my problem if it is now." Keanu cut him off. The manager scoffed. "And why's that?" Keanu reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the screen a few times. Then, he turned it around, showing the manager what was displayed. The man's face drained of color. It was a bank transfer confirmation. The amount, enough to buy the entire store. Keanu slipped the phone back into his pocket. "I own this place now." The entire front end of the store fell silent. The cashier, the customers, even the teenagers who had mocked George, all frozen in place. The manager stammered. You can't be serious." Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "I don't joke about things like this." He turned and walked back outside, where George was still pushing carts, unaware of what had just happened. Keanu handed him the water bottle and spoke in a voice only the old man could hear. "Go home, George." George frowned. "Son, I appreciate the kindness, but I can't just leave. I need this job." Keanu smiled, but there was something unshakable behind it. "Not anymore. You don't work here anymore." George's breath caught in his throat. "Did they fire me?" Keanu shook his head. "No, I just bought the store." The old man stared at him, his mouth slightly open. You did what?" Keanu put a hand on his shoulder. "And now, I'm telling you, you don't have to push carts to eat. You're done working. For good." George's lip trembled. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was awake or dreaming. Inside the store, the manager stood frozen, knowing his life had just changed in a way he never saw coming. And Keanu, he just stood there, watching as tears welled up in George's tired eyes. Next, George's hands trembled as he gripped the water bottle, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. His whole life had been a battle, scraping by, working himself to exhaustion just to afford a few meals a day. And now, in a matter of seconds, everything had changed. His lips quivered as he tried to speak. "Son, I don't know what to say." Keanu gave him a small smile. "Then don't. Just go home. Rest." But George hesitated. "I don't have a home," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Been living in a rented room for years. Can't afford much else." Keanu's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. He turned back toward the store, where the manager was still standing in shock. The customers had begun murmuring amongst themselves, whispers spreading like wildfire. Keanu raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Get the paperwork ready. I want every employee's salary doubled, and anyone over 60 working here is getting a full retirement package, paid out of my pocket." The manager's face twisted in confusion. What? You can't just." Keanu stepped closer. "I can. And I just did." The manager swallowed hard. He knew arguing was pointless. Keanu turned back to George. "And as for you, you're not going back to a rented room." He pulled his phone from his pocket again, tapped a few times, and then looked back up. "I just bought you a house. Fully paid. No rent. No bills. Nothing." George's breath hitched. His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. You don't even know me. Why would you do this?" Keanu exhaled, looking past George, past the store, past everything. "Because I know what it's like to struggle." His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. "And I know no one should have to at your age." George wiped his eyes, his frail hands shaking. This doesn't happen in real life." Keanu smiled softly. "It does now." A slow clap echoed through the parking lot. One of the customers had started applauding. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire front of the store erupted into cheers. The teenagers who had mocked George earlier looked down in shame. The cashier who had served Keanu wiped a tear from her cheek. And the manager, he simply stood there, defeated, realizing that the power he thought he had was now gone. But Keanu didn't wait for recognition. He simply patted George's shoulder, gave him a reassuring nod, and started walking toward his car. George called after him, "Son, I'll never forget this." Keanu turned back one last time, his hands in his pockets, his face calm. "Just promise me one thing, George." The old man sniffed, nodding. "Anything." Keanu's gaze was steady. "When you see someone struggling, don't walk past them. Do something." George's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to say another word. Keanu smiled once more, then got into his car and drove off, leaving behind a story no one would ever forget. The man who walked in as a stranger, left as a legend. The end. The story had ended for most people at the store, but for George, it was just beginning. That night, he sat in his new home, running his hands over the smooth wooden table, feeling the warmth of something he had never known before. Security. Peace. He could still hear Keanu's words in his head. When you see someone struggling, do something. George hadn't slept in a real bed in years. He lay down slowly, staring at the ceiling, his mind restless. He had spent his whole life believing people like Keanu didn't exist, people who helped without expecting anything in return. He had been wrong. And now, he had a choice. To just be grateful or to pass it forward. The next morning, George did something he never thought he'd do again. He walked into that same grocery store. But this time, not as a worker. He stood at the entrance, watching customers rush in and out, their lives moving too fast to notice what was happening around them. Then, he saw her. A woman in her late 50s, wearing a faded uniform, struggling to push a cart full of groceries while balancing a crying toddler on her hip. The exhaustion on her face was all too familiar. She reached the checkout counter, her hands shaking as she pulled out a few crumpled bills. The cashier gave her a sad look. "I'm sorry, ma'am, you're short $10. George stepped forward before she could say anything. "Take what you need. I've got it." The woman turned, confused. "Sir, I can't let you." George smiled. "Yes, you can. And one day, you'll do the same for someone else." She stared at him, her eyes glistening with tears. Thank you so much." George just nodded, because he finally understood. Keanu hadn't just changed his life. He had changed the way he saw the world. And that was the real gift. Days passed, but the story of what Keanu had done spread far beyond the grocery store. It started as whispers, employees telling their families, customers sharing it with friends. Then, someone who had witnessed the moment posted it online. A simple caption: "Keanu Reeves just bought a store to give a 90-year-old man the retirement he deserved." Who does that? The post exploded. Thousands of shares, millions of views. People from all over the country couldn't believe it. Celebrities commented. News outlets picked it up. The world was watching, and the question everyone kept asking was the same. Why would Keanu do this? Keanu, as always, stayed silent. No interviews, no statements. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because it was the right thing to do. But the world wasn't done talking. One night, as Keanu sat in a small diner, drinking coffee in a dimly lit booth, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Mr. Reeves, we need to talk. Urgent." Keanu exhaled slowly. He had a feeling something like this was coming. He replied with a single word. "Where?" An hour later, he pulled up to a massive corporate building, its glass windows reflecting the city lights. Inside, he was led into a boardroom where three men in expensive suits sat waiting. Their faces were cold, calculated, the kind of men who had never spent a day struggling but controlled the lives of those who did. The man in the center leaned forward. "Mr. Reeves, you've made quite a statement." Keanu leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "Did I?" The man smirked. "Buying a grocery store just to fire its manager and retire an old employee. That sends a message. People are talking. They're questioning things. That's dangerous." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous for who?" The room fell silent. The man on the right cleared his throat. "Look, we're businessmen. We don't operate on emotion. If people start expecting their jobs to take care of them, that's a problem. You've set a precedent, and frankly, we can't have that." Keanu nodded slowly. "So, let me guess. You want me to stay quiet? To pretend this never happened?" The first man smiled. "Not quite. We want you to help us. Be the face of a new initiative. Something controlled. A campaign about hard work and resilience. We'll pay you, of course, handsomely." Keanu let the words settle. Then, he chuckled. A low, amused laugh. He leaned forward, locking eyes with the man in the center. "Let me make sure I understand this." His voice was calm but sharp. "You want me to stand in front of millions of struggling people and tell them that breaking their backs for low wages is just resilience?" The man hesitated. "It's about inspiring them." Keanu's smile faded. "You don't want to inspire them. You want to keep them in line." The tension in the room thickened. The man on the left, who had been silent, finally spoke. "We're giving you a choice, Mr. Reeves. Work with us, or stay out of this. For your own good." Keanu studied them. Three powerful men, used to controlling everything. Used to people backing down. He exhaled. "You know, I came here thinking you'd try to buy me out. Maybe even threaten me." He stood up, sliding his hands into his jacket pockets. "But you made one mistake." The man in the center frowned. "And what's that?" Keanu tilted his head. "You thought I'd be afraid. The silence was deafening. Then, without another word, Keanu turned and walked out. He wasn't backing down. He was just getting started. Next.